Let's be honest, when we think about India's freedom struggle, our minds usually jump straight to 1885 and the Indian National Congress, right? But what if I told you that the real story, the foundational work, started decades before that? Today, we're diving into that crucial prehistory. We're talking about the pioneers, the early associations that first taught India how to organize, how to argue, and how to demand its rights. This is the story of the road to 1885. All right, so here's our game plan. First, we'll set the stage, get a feel for the 19th century political climate. Then, we're heading straight to the epicenter, Bengal, to look at the trailblazers there. After that, we'll broaden our map to see what was happening in Bombay and Madras. We'll then see how all these separate streams began to merge into this powerful all-India idea. And finally, we'll wrap up by understanding the incredible foundation they laid for the entire national movement. So, let's journey back to the 19th century. This was a time of massive change. The British Raj was firmly in place, and with it came English education. A whole new class of Indians was emerging, folks who were reading Western thinkers, learning about rights and democracy, and then looking around and starting to ask some very pointed questions about how their own country was being run. And this gets us to the heart of the matter. The Indian National Congress didn't just appear out of thin air in 1885. So how did people organize before then? And maybe more importantly, why should you care? Well, for anyone studying modern history, especially for competitive exams, understanding this is absolutely critical. It's about understanding the evolution, the slow, deliberate process of a nation finding its political voice. Okay, first things first, let's be super clear about what these groups were. These were not revolutionary movements calling for independence, not yet. Think of them more as organized clubs of educated and often quite wealthy Indians. Their goal was to work within the British system. Their main weapons, petitions, meetings, and strongly worded letters. They were trying to get the British to see the flaws in their own administration and make reforms. This was Politics 101, the very first steps. And the first real laboratory for this new kind of political activity, it had to be Bengal. I mean, it was the administrative capital, the intellectual hub of British India. It just makes sense that this is where the first real sparks of organized political action would start to fly. This timeline right here tells a really powerful story. Look at the progression. We kick off in the 1830s with groups like the Landholders' Society. The name says it all, right? It was about protecting the interests of the zamindars, the landed elite. But then, fast forward to 1876. The Indian Association, led by absolute giants like Surendranath Banerjee. This was a whole different ballgame. It wasn't for landlords, it was for the educated middle class. That's a huge shift from property to people, from narrow interests to broader political rights. Now this table, this is pure gold for your prep. Just look at the primary objective column. The Landholders' Society, protect interests of landlords, very specific. The British Indian Association broadens things to petition for reforms. But then look at the Indian Association, create strong public opinion, unify Indians on a common political program. Wow, that's not the language of a quiet petitioner anymore. That is the language of someone trying to build a nation. But of course, this wasn't just a Bengal story. This new political consciousness was contagious. It was spreading. So now let's shift our focus and travel west to the Bombay presidency and south to Madras to see how things were taking shape over there. And this is where it gets really interesting, because the vibe in these other regions was quite different. In Bengal, the movement was driven by the Bhadralok, the intellectuals, lawyers, journalists, thinkers. They were all about administrative reforms and political rights. But in Bombay, you had a huge influence from the Parsi merchant community. So naturally, their early concerns were often tied more closely to things like trade and commerce. Understanding this regional flavor is so important to see the complete picture. And here are the key players. You can't talk about Bombay without mentioning the grand old man of India, Dadabhai Naoroji, and his Bombay Association. Over in Pune, you had the Sarvajanic Sabha, which was this incredible bridge between the government and the people, led by the brilliant M.G. Ranade. And then down south, just a year before the INC, the Madras Mahajan Sabha came roaring onto the scene. You see, this wasn't happening in isolation. A network of ideas was crisscrossing the subcontinent. So you have all this amazing activity bubbling up in different places, but it also pointed to a big problem, a major weakness. And that brings us to this growing feeling, this dawning realization that to really make a dent, they needed to come together. And that was the fundamental issue, wasn't it? Think about it, a petition from Bombay about taxes, a memo from Madras about the civil services. It was too easy for the British to just dismiss them as local squabbles. Leaders started to see that the big issues, like the economic drain of wealth to Britain or the attacks on press freedom, these weren't just Bengal's problems or Bombay's problems. They were India's problems, and an Indian problem needed a single, powerful, all-India voice. And then a series of events in the late 1870s and early 80s basically threw gasoline on the fire. You had Lord Lytton's repressive policies like the Vernacular Press Act, which basically gagged the Indian language press. That caused huge anger. But the real earthquake was the Ilbert Bill controversy. When the government tried to pass a law allowing Indian judges to preside over cases involving Europeans, the racist backlash from the European community was shocking. It was a massive wake-up call for educated Indians, showing them just how deep the prejudice ran. This galvanized everyone and made forming a national body like the INC feel not just important, but absolutely urgent. Okay, so as we come to our final section, let's take a step back and really appreciate the big picture. What was the lasting impact of all this work? What's the real legacy of these pre-Congress pioneers? The key takeaway, the thing you absolutely have to remember is this. The Indian National Congress did not spring out of nowhere. It was built on a 50-year foundation painstakingly laid by these earlier organizations. They were the ones who created political awareness. They developed the toolkit of modern politics, the meetings, the petitions, the resolutions. They trained the first generation of nationalist leaders. And most importantly, they began the slow, difficult work of exposing the true exploitative nature of British rule. They didn't just pave the way, they made the journey possible. So I'll leave you with this final thought to chew on. If we see the founding of the INC in 1885 as the destination of this early phase, what do you think was the single most important milestone on that journey? Was it the creation of a group with a national vision, like the Indian Association? Or was it that raw, unifying shock of the Ilbert Bill controversy? Maybe it was something else entirely. The answer you choose says a lot about what you believe really drives a national movement forward. Something to think about.